We come today to one of the most famous stories of the Old Testament. You may remember it from your Sunday school days. It's the story about the chariot and the horses of fire and Elijah disappearing into heaven via a whirlwind. Hi, I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thank you for joining us today as we study 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. And today, at the end of our short video, I've got a special request of you that will help get these videos out to more people. So stay tuned for that. Now, before all this happened, before Elijah did disappear into the heavens, Elijah, along with his successor, Elisha, leave Gilgal. And Elijah asks Elisha to stay back, telling him that God had asked Elijah to go to Bethel. But Elisha says, "No way, I won't leave you." And the two headed to Bethel. And there something very interesting happens. The text says, the sons of the prophets at Bethel ask Elisha if he knew that, quote, God was going to take Elijah away from him as his senior or mentor that very day. And Elisha said that he did know, but told the sons of the prophets to chill, or more precisely, be still, or as the NAT says, be quiet. We'll get back to all this in a moment, but for now, let's follow the text. Elijah now says to Elisha, "Please stay here at Bethel, because God has sent me to Jericho." And Elisha once again says, "No, I won't leave you." And off the two of them go again, this time to Jericho. And again, sons of the prophets at Jericho ask Elisha the same question, and he responds in the same way. Now a third time, Elijah asks Elisha to stay at Jericho while he would go to the Jordan River where the Lord was sending him. Elisha responds the same way, and they both end up at the Jordan. In verse 7, the story takes somewhat of a different turn. Here we have 50 men of the sons of the prophets, not sure from what area. 50 men went and stood opposite Elijah and Elisha by the Jordan. And then in verse 8, we have a scenario that should remind us of a major event that took place in the book of Exodus. Elijah takes his mantle or his cloak, folds it up to make it stiffer or harder, whatever you like, and strikes the waters with it. The waters divide, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground, leaving the 50 men on the side from which they had come. Now, Robert Jameson gives us some ideas as to why the 50 sons of the prophets were tagging along. He says, quote, "They were desirous, in honor of the great occasion, to witness the miraculous translation of the prophet. The revelation of this striking event to so many was a necessary part of the dispensation, for it was designed to be under the law, like that of Enoch in the patriarchal age, a visible proof of another state and a type of the resurrection of Christ." End of quote. That's good enough reason to follow somebody. Once over the river, Elijah tells Elisha to ask him what he could do for him, quote, "before I am taken away." So he too knew he was going to be taken away. And Elisha quickly replies, "What I want is a double portion of your spirit to be upon me." Now, I like the way the NET Bible translates this as, quote, "the prophetic spirit that energizes you." That's what I want, a double portion of that, the prophetic spirit that energizes you. Elijah says, "Hey, that's a hard request, but if Elisha were to see Elijah when he was being taken away, he'd receive what he was asking for. But if he didn't see him, he wouldn't. In other words, he was wanting to make sure that Elisha was serious and would stick with him to the very end. And then the passage in verse 11, by telling us that as they went their way talking, there appeared a chariot of fire pulled by fiery horses. So this chariot of fire pulled by fiery horses comes between them, separates the two of them, and Elijah is taken up, not by the chariot, but by a whirlwind to heaven. Let's dig a little deeper into the sons of the prophets at this point. These were groups of individuals who were trained and mentored by prophets, serving as religious teachers and possibly assisting prophets in their duties. These guilds emerged from the time of the prophet Samuel, who gathered groups of people to learn and serve God, to learn about and to serve God. They were faith-based educational institutions focused on belief in God's communication and salvation. These guilds or schools were located in various places, including Ramah, Bethel, Gilgal, Jericho, Carmel, and Samaria. The guilds were led by a master prophet, and when the master died or was taken, one of the guild members would take their place. Some members of the guilds were married and lived in their own houses, while others were unmarried and lived in common buildings, sharing a common table for their meals. The sons of the prophets were trained teachers of religion, possibly assisting the prophets in their duties and eventually succeeding them. Over time, however, these guilds may have become corrupted, with some engaging in divination for money and for power. It does seem that it was common knowledge that Elijah would soon be carried into heaven, or translated, if you like, by a whirlwind. Presumably, there was a prophecy announcing this that at least some people knew about. We don't know. And Elijah seemed to test the devotion of Elisha. Now, since it was known that Elijah would soon depart to heaven in an unusual way, Elisha wanted to stay as close as possible to his mentor. So that explains why I won't leave you 3 times. David Gusick gives us some background on what Elisha wished for when Elijah asked him what he could do for him. Elisha asked for a big thing, a double portion of the mighty spirit of Elijah. Elisha saw how greatly the Spirit of God worked through Elijah, and he wanted the same for himself. Gusick says, quote, "The idea of a double portion was not to ask for twice as much as Elijah had, but to ask for the portion that went to the firstborn son, as in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17. Elisha asked for the right to be regarded as the successor of Elijah, as his firstborn son in regard to ministry. Yet Elijah had already been designated as Elijah's successor. We learned that in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 19. This here was a request for the spiritual power to actually fulfill the calling he already received." End of quote. Of course, the question arises, is this generally a good or a bad thing? Normally, we don't think of one person inheriting the ministry of another. This isn't a family business that we pass down. The relation between Elijah and Elisha and God's apparent blessing on their ministries, however, as we read it here, shows us that at least sometimes God intends one person to inherit the ministry of another. We see this happening today when a minister of a local church arranges to have his son or daughter take over his ministry of that same church. Is it a good thing? Well, based on this passage, it seems that it can be, providing that it is God's doing and not that of either the senior or the junior involved. We leave the manipulating of such inheritance of these kinds of situations to kings and to politicians and to business people, but not prophets or ministers of the gospel. Now, with respect to Elijah's being taken to heaven, commentator Wiseman says this, quote, Elijah was taken up to heaven in the whirlwind, not in the chariot of fire and horses of fire, which merely came between the two of them. That's how the Hebrew reads. And he was cut off from human sight. Elijah was cut off from human sight. These chariots and horsemen symbolized strong protection, as well as the forces of God's spiritual presence, which were the true safety of Israel. End of quote. Now that's one detail or two that our Sunday school teachers missed. I want to end our study today with some words from Matthew Henry about the miraculous crossing of the Jordan River that we read about here. This was, he says, and I'm quoting now, the preface to Elijah's translation into the heavenly Canaan, as it had been to the entrance of Israel into the earthly Canaan. He must go on to the other side of the Jordan to be translated, because it was his native country, and that he might be near the place where Moses died, and thus honor might be put on that part of the country which was most despised at the time. He and Elisha might have gone over Jordan by a ferry, as other passengers would do in those days. But God would magnify Elijah in his exit as he did Joshua in his entrance by the dividing of this river. Joshua 3, verse 7. As Moses with his rod divided the sea, so Elijah with his coat or mantle divided Jordan, both being the insignia or the badges of their offices. These waters of old yielded to the ark, and now they're yielding to the prophet's mantle, which to those that wanted the ark was an equivalent token of God's presence. When God will take up his faithful to heaven, death is the Jordan which, immediately before their translation, they must pass through. And they find a way through it as safe and a comfortable way. The death of Christ has divided those waters, that the ransomed of the Lord may pass over. O death, where is thy sting, thy hurt, thy terror? End of quote by Matthew Henry. Friends, next time we'll see how Elisha takes over from Elijah. Join us for that. But today I need to ask for a favor. I found out that YouTube's algorithms are dependent on people actually liking a YouTube post and on the number of comments that we get. So the more likes and the more comments, the more YouTube promotes the video. Otherwise, it gets lost and nobody sees it after it's out for about an hour. So please help us out by doing that, at least by liking our video, if not commenting, although I would love your comments as well. Please do that each time you enjoy one. Thank you. And above all, do keep on studying the Word of God.